All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for those in the room and online for joining us today. To start off the day in a good way, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting within the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people with unique cultures and worldviews. I acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And also, as everyone can see, we have many individuals joining us from elsewhere on Turtle Island, each with their own unique and rich history, which I strongly encourage everybody to familiarize yourselves with. And so today I will be hosting, kind of leading us through the event. My ancestors first arrived in what we commonly call Canada in about 1840. And so I recognize that the species we're talking about today, the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, has existed alongside the aforementioned peoples since time immemorial, and that I am privileged by the opportunity to contribute to the conservation of this species, which is innately valuable and holds profound ecological and cultural importance. So, today's event is brought to you by the SEMRIG Group, the Canadian Eastern Massasauga Rattlesnake Recovery and Implementation Group. It is a mouthful, but a lot of you are members, may be very familiar with what we do, and some not so much. So I will go through a bit about what SEMRIG is and specifically what our the working group is that those of us who organized today's event are part of. But if you have any questions that come up during today that we're not able to get to, or general questions about SEMRIG, interest in joining, anything like that, our email address is here. It's just semrig@gmail.com. So feel free to reach out at any time. We'll get back to you with information. Moving on. Okay, so here's our agenda for the day. So right now we're just doing welcome and housekeeping. Then we will open the floor for Kyle Horner to give the keynote presentation. That will take about an hour. And then we'll have a break. And if needed, we'll adjust the break time a little bit, but we're going to try really hard to stay on time today. And then the afternoon, the after break period will be more about introducing the rest of the panelists, getting to know what their various areas of expertise are, and then we'll open the floor for questions and go through, and yeah, hopefully cover a lot of ground today. Just very briefly, a reminder that we are all here for the same reason. We all have an interest and a vested commitment to conserving this species, and that we're all at various points in our learning journeys. So some of us may be more practiced and more knowledgeable in some areas than others, but all questions are welcome. And we do expect that everyone be kind to each other and be open and willing to listen and to learn. Everybody is welcome to participate, and I really do hope that that one way or another, whether you unmute and speak or you're here and speaking or in the chat, it would be great to hear from everyone so that we all get a chance to learn from the questions that our neighbors have as well. And so just briefly, this group that we're here, kind of a bunch of us are representing and are part of, and that's putting on this event, we're focused on collaboratively implementing conservation efforts for the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. This is the only venomous snake that is currently in Ontario, and this group is made up of educators and researchers and government employees, First Nations representatives and individuals. It really is a huge effort to connect all these different groups who each have a role to play in ensuring that this species stays on the landscape for years to come. And this group has several working groups. And so that's what those of us who are here, we're part of the Community Science and Outreach Working Group. So we're really trying to develop outreach and education approaches that will support the conservation of the species, hopefully addressing and alleviating the threats that they face. And so our three main objectives are to host an annual outreach event. So this is the event for this year. We also hope to develop targeted and effective social marketing campaigns and then take on other priorities as we're able and as we're sort of directed by working group members and also by things like the recovery strategies to help us, identify, excuse me, and prioritize other efforts. And so I should mention, so today we're doing this hybrid event. This is the first time that we've attempted a hybrid event. So far, what we've held has all been online. So we're super grateful for the Toronto Zoo. Rick and Nigel have been amazing throughout the planning process in ensuring that we have this space to use, the tech setup, the food and coffee for those of you who are here in person. And so just, thank you. Yeah, thank you for making that happen. And today's goal, so really I want to clarify and really emphasize that we're all here to learn from each other and to learn from our experiences and the knowledge that is held by some of the members of the attendees, but especially those of the panelists. And so we are looking to prepare people with the tools and tactics and information to effectively communicate about this species, which is often persecuted because of fear or perceptions that are rooted in misinformation. And so just to be clear, like we're not really speaking today about the ecology of the species. There's certainly many resources out there, both physical and online, that do detail that information. And if that's something you're interested in, please send us an email. We would be happy to help put you, connect you with those resources or with people who may be able to help. But we will be doing our best today to stay very focused on the science communication piece. And again, our email address is there, so feel free to reach out at any time. And I'm just gonna leave this up, and Hannah, are you okay to share the poll results? Yeah. Do you need another minute?
All right, so I have a feeling I started the poll before some online people joined, so we didn't quite get everyone, but I think we're okay. For the folks in the room, virtually and in person, we have about 20% of people from nonprofit organizations or NGOs. We've got about 5% from for-profit organizations, about 16% from research, academic, or educational institutions, about 2% from Indigenous organizations or government, about 5% from a community group, about 16% from a municipal government or conservation authority, 15% from the provincial or federal government, and 9% from other interested community members. So that's for panelists as well. This is who you're working with, and let's pass it on to Kyle.
Okay, yes. And so moving on to our keynote, I'll just give Kyle an introduction and then pass over the mic and clicker to him. So Kyle Corner is a science communicator, writer, and naturalist from Guelph, Ontario. He has worked in education and outreach for parks, zoos, nonprofits, nature centers, and the University of Guelph, where he developed and taught an undergraduate course in science communication. He has a particular love for teaching others about traditionally less appreciated aspects of nature and has worked extensively with reptiles, both in field and educational settings. He is currently the Nature Counts Engagement Coordinator at Birds Canada, a tour leader for the Quest Nature Tours, and the author of a recently published book, Turtles of North America. So Kyle, please come on up. Sorry.
Thank you for that. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all here today. Some familiar faces here and some familiar names in the chat too, so that's awesome to see, and lots of new faces as well. So yeah, my name is Kyle, and I'm excited, really excited to be here today to talk to you about two of my very favorite things in the world, good, effective communication, and rattlesnakes. I love them both so much. I can't decide. They're both so cool. So it's awesome to put them together. I'm really excited about that. And I assume that you're all here, you here in person and you online, because you have your own connection to this species. But also probably because you find yourself at some point or another, maybe in your work or in your personal life, having the need to teach others or to speak to others about snakes, about rattlesnakes. And so you find yourself in the role of a science communicator, whether you meant to or not. I actually think science communication is kind of a funny field because it is a complex and interesting field unto itself, and most people end up in it by accident. I think a lot of people who wind up being science communicators in their career on some level, maybe they started in science itself or in some other field in conservation, and they wind up needing to teach science. And so even though it's a complex field and it's something we should all learn to do in a formal way, we tend to end up there by accident and without any real formal training. And actually, there's not that much formal training available in science communication. So even if you really tried, it's hard to get. And I think that makes it really interesting because a lot of people do science communication using their intuition and using sort of trial and error and just learning on the job, which is great sometimes, but sometimes it falls a little bit short. And it would be really useful to have that underpinning of how science communication works. What is the science behind science communication? And also what can we learn from the arts, because it's kind of a crossover discipline in that way. So that's kind of what I'll focus on today. We'll do sort of conceptual overview a little bit of science communication, some of those broad concepts that underpin the field as they relate a little bit to Massasaugas. And then we're going to have the opportunity in that panel discussion afterwards to maybe drill down into some of the specific practical sort of experiences a little bit more. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of foundation, and then we'll have lots of great questions in that panel discussion. So if we're going to dive into science communication, doesn't work. Oh no. Oh, weird. It's backwards. Cool. Okay. Good to know. So if we're going to talk about science communication, we should define science communication. I know that seems a little bit goofy, but I think it's important because I think a lot of people, when they imagine what science communication is, they have like a pretty narrow definition. You know, we tend to think of it in a very formal way. Science communication could be like delivering a presentation at a conference or writing an academic paper or teaching a class in science. We often think of things like science popularizers, maybe like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye. And we often, for whatever reason, tend to think of the physical sciences, maybe because that's what a lot of those science popularizers work in, like Bill Nye. It's always like physics and chemistry, you know, and Neil deGrasse Tyson the same. But the definition is much broader than that. So science communication is really any attempt to communicate about or teach about or raise awareness of or even just interest in scientific topics, which of course includes biology and the biological sciences as well. It can be very formal, like a conference presentation. It can be a field trip with kids outside. I stole that picture, that's okay. It's a great picture. It can be a one-on-one conversation with a child about a snake. That's fantastic too. It all fits in this realm of science communication. And not only is it diverse in who you're talking to, it's diverse in its format as well. So it doesn't have to be a lecture. It doesn't have to be me standing in front of a crowd. It can be signage, right? It can be written, it can be visual, it can be an article in a magazine, it can be social media. There's millions of different formats. So anytime you're trying to communicate with somebody about science in any way, that fits. Maybe obviously under this banner of science communication, but I think it's just important to know that it's broader than a lot of people think. And you might just be having a conversation with your neighbor across the backyard fence, but that falls under this realm of science communication as well. And the same principles that underpin the formal conference presentation can underpin that conversation with your neighbor over the fence. So it's just good to keep in mind. I think it's also important to know that we divide science communication into two categories. So on the one hand, we have scientists communicating to other scientists, so expert to expert, like at a conference, like when you're writing a paper for a scientific journal, things like that, that we would call science inReach. And inReach, if you took a science degree, is what you learned to do, right? In a science degree, you learn to communicate your science via papers, via presentations, via those hideous posters they make at conferences. We all know those hideous posters, and really need to change those. That's inReach. That's what we learn to do in our science education. Science outreach is expert to non-expert, and that could take any form, right? That could be me talking to a grade 3 class. That can be chatting with somebody at an educational display at a cottages association. That could be at a zoo or a museum. It could be on social media. It could be anything else where an expert or relative expert in a field is speaking to a non-expert. Usually, we don't get this training in a science degree. Usually, we're not taught to do outreach. It's coming up, it's happening a little bit more now, but not often and not nearly as much as inReach. And I think that's a really important distinction because if you did a science degree, I know many of you here probably did, the things that you learned about science inReach are all wrong for science outreach. All those techniques, everything you learn, like imagine those hideous posters, like imagine trying to get an uninterested member of the public to read a conference poster, awful, right? So the things that you learned about science inReach, they're just wrong for science outreach. And when I teach university students to do outreach, I have to untrain them all those things that they've learned. For so many reasons. I mean, science outreach includes a lot of artistic stuff, artistic discipline, And if you're a science student, you channel into science in like grade 8, right? You almost stop taking like English and arts and things like that. So it's really a whole other field to learn to do science outreach, and the things that work in outreach are often very different. So something to keep in mind as well as we go through. So what I'm going to do today, I have 7 tips. That's how we're going to structure this. I have my 7 tips to be a good science communicator. They're longer than most tips, but that's okay. So we'll go through 7 principles that I think should underpin good science communication. We'll think a little bit about how that might relate to talking about Massasauga specifically. So first and foremost, if we're going to learn about science communication, you should know that good science communication is not just about information. Actually, I would say it's not even primarily about information. And I think this is really important because most of us, our default, if I gave you somebody right now and I said, talk to this person about Massasaugas, your default is going to be to go to telling them the things that you know about Massasauga rattlesnakes. I've seen enough presentations about animals, about whatever else, where the person is just bombarding you with facts, right? It's like, here's a bunch of cool stuff about this animal, or here are all the things I know about this animal. And that's fun for us as biology people, as people who like this species, you know, and we love to learn those facts, but it doesn't always work for other people, and especially for people that you're trying to convince of things. And we can understand this if we go way back in the history of science communication, because science communication in its current form, the sort of formal discipline, started in the middle of the 1800s with these formal university lectures. So big universities in the States and in England would host these lectures, and they were to sort of show off to other universities. So you would invite scientists from other universities and be like, look at the cool science we're doing. But they also opened them to the public. Because there was this sense, oh, weird, it's changed my numbering, cool. Pretend there are numbers going over. There was this sense that like the unwashed masses, the public, their lives would be better if they knew more about science. Right? And this is at a time when most people don't have much education in science. And so the universities, they sort of felt like, hey, the public would be better off if they had an education in science. And in particular, they would be more trusting of science and scientific advancement. This is a time when you're getting exciting developments like the steam train, and the printing press, which is bringing books to people more readily, also powered by steam in their beginning. And so the idea was, hey, people, you know, they don't trust in science, they don't believe in these new advancements, they're skeptical, they're wary, and that's because they don't have enough information about science. So if we tell them all the things we know, then they will trust science and they will behave in a way that is consistent with the science, and that'll work. This model is called the deficit model of science communication. It basically says you have a deficit in your understanding of science, and if I fill that deficit with information, then you will trust science, you'll believe in science, you'll do the things that science tells you to do. So those are the assumptions it makes. But both of these assumptions are flawed. So we know that this doesn't work. And actually, if you think about it intuitively, it makes sense that this doesn't work. Because people use many factors besides just information to form their opinions and to decide on their behaviors. You know, if you think about people who don't believe in climate change, people who don't believe in climate change are not short on information about climate change. There is so much information available. It's out there, and people are inundated with it. And if you vocally don't believe in climate change, you probably hear more climate change information than most people, because everybody's trying to convince you that it's real. So the reason they don't believe in climate change is not because they don't have enough information. It's based on a bunch of other factors, and we know this to be true. And that probably translates to snakes as well. You know, there are people who hate snakes, not because they don't have information about snakes, but because they just have other factors in their life that determine the way they feel, the way they believe, the way that they act. And it's actually demonstrated, it's been experimentally demonstrated, that your scientific literacy is actually not a good predictor of your feelings about science in general, whether you believe in it, whether you trust scientists, that sort of thing. So we know that this deficit model is flawed. The reason that's true has a little bit to do with psychology. And so we can draw on psychology in our science communication to understand how the human brain works. And this is really important because when you're doing science communication, you're trying to communicate to a human brain, which is a vastly imperfect thing. It's really flawed in a lot of ways. So you got to understand how it's flawed so you know how to talk to it. And the big issue that your brain has is it's super lazy. Your brain doesn't like to work hard. It has limited resources. My brain is like my computer, right? If I ask it to do too many things at once, it like gets real hot and the fan runs real loud and eventually it shuts down and you get the blue screen. I get the blue screen a lot. So you can't overtax the human brain. And so the brain has these tricks that it uses, right? When it has to make a decision, when it has to solve a problem, it uses shortcuts. Always looks for the path of least resistance, the easiest way to make that decision to solve that problem. There's actually a theory in psychology called the cognitive miser theory, which actually dictates this whole thing. And then you do it regardless of how smart you are. So you might think, you know what, I'm a smart person. Like I always think through problems. I always really analyze situations. I always take in all the available information. You don't. You're not too smart for the cognitive bias theory. You're not too smart for your human brain. Everybody does this, and you don't know when you're doing it. So you might like make a decision in your life, a big decision, or form an opinion. You know, you have an opinion about mass sagas, you have an opinion about social justice, whatever it is, and you think to yourself, yeah, I really thoroughly considered that issue, and I now have an opinion that's very informed. Probably not. Probably not entirely, because you don't know where your brain is taking these shortcuts, and it definitely is. Doesn't mean that your opinion's not good and informed, but you'd be surprised if you really knew what your brain is doing. And these shortcuts, they have a name. They're called heuristics. Now, there's lots of different heuristics. There's so many. So I won't bore you with a crazy long list, but if you're interested in this stuff, you can look it up because there's like hundreds of them. But these are the types of shortcuts that your brain takes. And it's interesting to know a few because you kind of get the sense of what you're fighting with. So, for example, if you need to make a decision, you might use something like the availability heuristic. Now, the availability heuristic is literally the reason that advertising works, because that means that you favor the thing that comes most easily to mind. So you can imagine yourself walking into like a convenience store and you're super thirsty, it's a hot day, and you would like a refreshing beverage, and you stand in front of those fridges of all the cold drinks you can possibly imagine, and you think, what do I want to drink today? And you might think that you survey all the different drinks and you really think about them and you make a decision based on what you really want. But if you saw a poster for Coke coming in the store, you're likely to get a Coke, you know, because it comes closest to mind. That's why Coke spends billions of dollars on advertising, because they know if you see Coke everywhere, then when you want a cold drink, the first thing that comes to your mind is Coke, and you're more likely to buy Coke or Gatorade or whatever it is. So that's the availability heuristic.
Sorry,
yeah, no,
can you speak up a little, please?
Sure, I'll try to be even loud. I'm a loud person, so I'm sure I can manage. He says, I just like no. So you got too loud. I don't know. I'll try to find the balance. But let me know if it's no good. You might use the anchoring heuristic to make a decision. Anchoring is a heuristic where you favor the thing that you learned first. For snakes, that's the perfect example of this, because we are more likely to fall back to the thing we first learned. And for snakes, the thing most of us first learned is they're terrifying, right? If you saw a movie when you were a child, if you had a snake in your backyard and your parent reacted negatively, you had a negative first impression of snakes. And so you're more likely to go back to that. It's hard to break away from that anchor. And yeah, excellent. My volume is good. I'll try to maintain it. So the anchoring heuristic means you're drawn to that thing you learned first. Affect means that you're drawn to the thing that makes you feel good, right? That's a positive emotional association. For most people, that sadly is not snakes. You know, they're drawn to puppies and kittens and things that make them feel good, but a lot of people don't have positive emotional association with snake. Fluency, that's the thing that you understand the best. So you can think of this in terms of climate change. I think that's really easy. Like, is it easier to understand the nuances and science of climate change, or is it easier to understand that it's all a government hoax and it's all a lie? You know, you can sort of see that it's much easier to just be like, it's all fake, it's not real. I don't have to deal with this complex information. You know, certainly for a lot of people, snakes aren't easy to understand. They're an animal that's very different from us. They're not intuitive to us. And so a lot of people just don't take the time. We go the direction of things that are easier to understand. It's easy to understand they're super scary and I should stay away from them. That's really simple. It's harder to understand the nuance. Similarly, the familiarity heuristic that favors things that are familiar to us. You know, a lot of us didn't grow up around snakes, so that's not super familiar to a lot of folks. And the social proof heuristic that favors the things that other people are doing. Well, the world hates snakes. You know, everybody doesn't like snakes, and maybe my neighbors at the cottage kill snakes, so I can make that decision because that's what everybody else is doing. Because you can really see how these shortcuts start to influence the way we think, and they're more powerful oftentimes than the facts and the information that we have. Not only that, a lot of the systems that are around us, they can influence these heuristics, right? So the heuristic decision-making, the shortcuts you take are going to be influenced by the people around you, by your political and cultural affiliations, by your personal experiences, your religious beliefs. There's so many things that can affect how we make decisions, and media makes it worse. It exacerbates it. You know, social media is an echo chamber. It just shows us ideas we already know, and it just gets worse. And traditional media for snakes is terrible, as we all know, right? Like they get a pretty bad rap. So all in all of this to say that it's way more than information that decides what we do and what we think. And that means that if we want to change people's opinions or change their behaviors, we have to do it with more than just information. If you just give somebody facts, it's not going to change the way they behave. We have to go a little bit deeper. So not all about information. So what do we do? What are we to do when confronted with this? Well, good science communication, it needs to consider the audience. And that sounds really obvious. And you know, you read that and you sort of think, oh, yeah, of course, I have to think about the audience. But even in the formal field of science communication, this is a relatively new concept. Like even in the early to mid 1900s, people weren't really thinking about the audience. It was like lecture style, even on the TV shows that were popular about science at the time. It's actually not until like the 70s where you see science TV shows actually doing market research and actually trying to understand their audience better, and formal audience research in other disciplines of science communication, even following after that. So this is a relatively new idea in the field, amazingly, even though it seems so obvious and so intuitive. But if we're going to communicate with an audience, we have to think about the audience in order to communicate effectively with them, right? Super logical. There's lots of ways we can do that. But one of my favorites is this concept in psychology called the theory of planned behavior. And this is a theory that tries to help us understand how people behave and why people behave in the way they do. The animation's working. Cool. Now, all of this theory tells us very simply is that human behaviors are underpinned by their beliefs. So if somebody does a thing, there's a reason, and it has to do with what they believe deep down, something that in their brain, right? And that if we're going to then affect those behaviors, we have to deal with the beliefs, right? So if somebody kills snakes at their cottage, you can't just say, well, don't kill snakes. You have to understand why they are killing snakes. We have to address the belief rather than just the behavior, right? Because if we don't go deeper, they're just going to ignore you and keep doing the thing that's consistent with what they believe. This theory divides the beliefs into three categories. We're on 2 clicks. All kinds of weird stuff going on. Holy cow. Okay. Too far. Oh, no animation's there. Okay. So we have three categories of beliefs. We have behavioral beliefs, normative beliefs, and control beliefs. I'll talk about each one. So behavioral beliefs, that's a belief that relates to the behavior. That's something like, we could look at that as an if-then statement, right? If I go too close to a snake, something horrible will happen and I will die. That's a behavioral belief. It's not accurate, but it doesn't matter if you believe it, right? So that's a behavioral belief about snakes. And that's going to dictate how you behave around snakes. And so that's one that we can kind of get to a little bit with information, right? This belief is based on this information. And so we can sort of counter this one with information. That's good. Easy peasy. Normative beliefs, much harder. That has to do with what other people think of you. So if other people think that it's normal to be afraid of snakes or to kill snakes or whatever it is, then you think it's normal and that's fine. And you can go ahead and do it. This is much harder for us as communicators to deal with because I can't control what other people think, right? I can't make your neighbors think differently or behave differently. I can show you a counterpoint. I can show you that I think differently and that there are other people in the world that think differently. You know, I love snakes. I think they're really amazing, and I can provide that counterpoint, but I can't really change what the other people in your life think. So this one's a little bit trickier. We can do our best to show a counterpoint, but we can't really affect half of this belief. But the most interesting one to me is control beliefs. So control beliefs have to do with your perceived control of a situation, not your actual control of a situation, but whether you believe you have control of your situation. And one that I've seen many, many times is I can't get over my fear of snakes. And I've had people, and I know Jenny will nod at the back because I know she's had it too, who will say, I know I shouldn't be afraid of them. I know it's dumb. You know, I know they're harmless. I know they're beneficial. I know they're great. I just can't get over my fear of snakes. That's a control belief. It's whether you believe you have control of the situation. You do have control. You just don't think you do, right? And so this to me is a really interesting one because this is where we can't really deal with it with facts. The person has all the facts. They think the snakes are fine and good, but they have this perception of control. And so we can approach that in a sensitive way by trying to empower that person with control over their situation. I think that's really, really important. So we have to understand these fundamental beliefs in our audience. And this is where science communication becomes much more about dialogue than about lecture or providing information. If I speak to that person and I just tell them all information and I tell them what I think is important, I'm not addressing their beliefs because I'm not asking them, I'm not learning about them or figuring out what their beliefs are. So I need to engage in a dialogue and I need to be empathetic. I think empathy is like the most important quality in a science communicator. I need to understand where they're coming from so that I can help to begin that dialogue and to change, hopefully, their beliefs and ultimately their behaviors. And if you're not empathetic, if you're not engaging in the dialogue, then you can never do that. And I always look for conflict, right? So that person who says, you know I shouldn't be afraid of snakes, but I can't get over my fear, that's conflict in those beliefs, right? We have a behavioral belief that works, it's good, we believe good things about snakes. We have a control belief that's limiting. And that's the perfect place to begin a dialogue. Right? Well, if you know all these things about snakes, if you know that they're harmless, why do you think you're afraid? And now we can have a conversation and we can get going. It's amazing actually how often if you ask somebody that question, they will identify something concrete. You sort of think these fears are vague, but they'll say something like, when I was 5, my brother chased around with snakes or something like that. And you can actually start to nail it down. And that person starts to go, yeah, I guess that's a bit goofy to be afraid of them because my brother chasing around with them. We can have like a good talk. So this kind of communication, it really requires empathy and dialogue. And you can't always rely on your intuition because what's intuitive to me about snakes is not intuitive to that person who's afraid of snakes. So intuition is great if I'm communicating with somebody who thinks like me, but it's not useful if I'm communicating with somebody who doesn't. And so think about dialogue, think about those conflicts, those contradictions, and think about how you can empower people with control to do the thing that you'd like them to do. I know we'll hear more from Jenny on the panel later. I always point towards Jenny because we've done a lot of snake stuff together. But Jenny, if you don't know Jenny, is always out there trying to get people over their fear of snakes by meeting snakes and touching snakes and getting that close experience. And sometimes we'll get somebody who is saying, hey, do you want to come touch a snake? Maybe it'll be a child, and their parent will be really pressuring them to do it, but you'll see the kid is afraid or is nervous. And to me, one of the most powerful things you can say to that child is, you can touch a snake if you want. You don't have to, but you can if you want. I won't make you. You don't have to, but you can. And that takes the pressure off that situation. That empowers that kid with the control of the situation. And more often than not, then they'll move forward and they'll go on with that experience. But when they felt they had no control, they weren't ready. They weren't prepared to take that leap. So empowering people with control, it's your big weapon in science communication, I think, and something we need to think a lot about, especially with scary things like snakes. I have a note in here about phobias. This is not something I usually talk much about, but it's very pertinent here. And actually, we were chatting about it before we started. So maybe I should append this slide now because we had some very interesting conversation just before the talk. But I think it's important to think about fear and phobia. Some of them don't. So when we're talking snakes, we're talking about fear. That's sort of yeah, when we're talking about snakes, we're talking a lot about fear, right? Especially Massasaugas, right? People are very afraid. And I think it's important to know that fear and phobia, there is a line or at least a gradient between them. So fear is a rational response to something that you think is dangerous. It has more to do with your perception of danger, right? You can be afraid of a garter snake. We know that a garter snake is not dangerous, but other people don't, right? People think all snakes are dangerous. So if you think a garter snake is dangerous and you're afraid of it, you can have a fear. That's rational. It's logical to be afraid of snakes. And I never fault somebody for being afraid of snakes because in the world we live in, it's very logical, right? People are inundated all the time with scary stuff about snakes. And if everything you see about snakes is scary and says that they're scary and dangerous, it's extremely rational to be afraid of snakes. For somebody with a more mild fear of snakes, sometimes a little bit of information goes a long way because they think snakes are dangerous. So if you can show them that snakes are not dangerous, well, that's going to really help with that fear. A phobia is an irrational response to something that may or may not be dangerous, right? You can have a phobia of butterflies. That's a ridiculous phobia. It makes no sense. But phobias by their definition are irrational, right? And with snakes, especially something like a venomous snake, like a Massasauga, it's much muddier, right? It's very clear that if you're petrified of butterflies, that's irrational. But with snakes, you have this gradient between like what's rational, which is a fear of snakes because you know that or you think that they're scary, and a phobia, which is like this crippling, irrational fear that people have. The more severe it gets, the more you get into phobia territory, the harder it is to get people over it because it is inherently irrational. So information is not going to help you because they can have all the information they want. They're making an irrational subconscious decision to be afraid. So phobias, more than anything else, they require that empathy. They require that dialogue and that sensitivity. And to get over a really crippling phobia, it takes time, like a lot of time. So it's just important to kind of have that in mind if you have somebody that has this like really crippling reaction to something, that just takes like real sensitivity and real time. And it's useful to, people really with phobias, they always feel cornered, they always feel pressured. So it's useful to really say like, oh, we got lots of time, or if you have the opportunity to really take some time really slowly with that person, just think about like, how can we make this as safe and non-threatening a place for that person as possible and give them as much time as we can to get over it. So yeah, it can be really tough. Phobias are a crazy thing. So just something to keep in mind. There's no like magic key with phobias. You just have to approach it with great sensitivity. So just something to think about. Okay, so we've sort of covered how to approach, right? Information enough is not alone. We have to think about the audience. We have to think about what they're doing in their brain. And now that we've done that, well, what do we say? So good science communication, in my mind, is both strategic and it's simple. And by strategic, what I mean is that it's message focused. So again, sometimes our impetus is to say, oh, I want to tell you everything I know about Massasaugas. Like, here's this cool animal. It's so amazing. But if we have a key message, which with Massasaugas we probably do, right? Whether that's a message about conservation or not killing them or how to coexist with them in your cottage or whatever it is, we need to decide what those messages are in advance. And we need to focus on them and develop, if we're doing any sort of formal communication, really develop our communication around them. They should be entirely the focus And if you have extraneous details, things that don't complement the message or serve a purpose, oftentimes the best thing to do is cut them out. I know we want to share everything we know all the time, but if you go to a 20-minute presentation where somebody just inundates you with information about the Mass Saga, you might walk away remembering very little. You might walk away remembering a couple of interesting facts that you thought were kind of neat, but don't really tie to any particular message. So if you want people to walk away with the message, you got to be strategic. You have to decide what the messages are, and you have to build your communication around them so that people have that key takeaway at the end. It's really, really important. Oh, now we're not going at all. Oh, there we go. We're good. We're rocking. So if we're deciding on our message and we're developing our communication, a couple of things that I think are helpful, especially for folks with a science background, because science teaches us to include every detail, right? If you did a science degree and you wrote papers, you include every single detail and you be as precise as you can. But as a science communicator, I think it's much more valuable to let go of that precision, to relax a little bit your concern about precision, and really focus on broad concepts. Right, we want people to remember the grand ideas. Mass sagas aren't that scary. They're actually really important. They need our help, things like that. That precision, those exact details, cramming in every detail you can, not that important. That's for the scientific paper for later on. Or if people are interested and if they have questions, of course, you can always go that route. But focus on those big, broad concepts. Avoid jargon at all costs. Really difficult for scientists, I tell you. I never want to see another scientific name in science outreach ever again. That's my personal goal. I have a real beef about that. Even like on Instagram, people being like, sister is Captain Up. Nobody cares. No scientific names, no jargon. And remember that if you do have a science background, and if you work in conservation, if you work with snakes every day, whatever it is, the things that are intuitive to you, the things that are part of your daily language you don't even think about, are not part of the daily language oftentimes of your audience. I always remember very profoundly doing a kindergarten program with another fellow, and he was teaching the kindergartens. I thought he was doing quite a good job with the kindergartens for the most part. And he was teaching them about, I can't even remember what it was, a snake or a bird or something. And a couple of times he used the word marsh. And finally, the kindergarten teacher said, I think it might be really helpful if you could just tell the kids what a marsh is. And I think that's maybe an extreme example because they're 4. But at the same time, like, who thinks of marsh? Like, marsh is just a word that you hear every day. Like, obviously it makes sense, but not if you're 4. Right? So you need to think about like these, and that if we bring that up towards like ectothermic, for example, like nobody knows what that is. You have to explain that if you're going to use it, right? So just keep in mind that like jargon, it becomes incorporated into our daily parlance, into our daily language. That doesn't mean that our audience knows it. Avoid the temptation to try to sound smart. I tell you, put people in front of an audience and everybody's smiling because you all think that wouldn't be me. Holy cow, sometimes with the need to like be the expert. And I think that's based sometimes on a bit of insecurity. Maybe you feel a little insecure, a little nervous about doing a presentation. Maybe you haven't really done it before. You know, we all feel a little imposter complex sometimes for sure. But you don't need to try to sound smart. People will understand that you're smart. So it's much better to just like talk like a normal human being and not try to sound academic. The era of like formal academic science communication is over. We just need to talk like normal human beings, and so that we can connect with our audience. So try to avoid that temptation. I won't say that I'm immune to it. It's in my brain as well, but you don't have to sound smart. And make complex concepts as simple as you can. This kind of goes with jargon, right? But like if we're talking about ecology and conservation, like there's some complex ideas in ecology that maybe we learned in school that somebody who didn't do a science degree didn't learn. So just think about those concepts. And like I always try to think about somebody in my life. Like think about your mother, your cousin, or your nephew, or like somebody who doesn't have a science background, and think, hey, would this person understand what I'm saying right now? Like try to make it real to yourself. Think about a real person that you know that doesn't have a background in science, and ask yourself if they would understand. When we're simplifying concepts, I love, this is where we start to get into like the art of science communication. I like literary tools. I love to write, but they work in spoken communication as well. So just as one option here to simplify your concepts, we might refer to some of these literary tools and maybe learn in grade 4. I remember learning similes when I was 10 years old. But analogies, metaphors, similes, these literary comparisons are a great way to make things relatable. They also help us sometimes to add a bit of color, to evoke the senses, to be humorous. Humor is a great weapon in science communication. So like definitely you can disarm, you can add some humor. That's a great thing to do. You know, you can come up with much better ones than me, but like here's a few that are just off the top of my head. There's lots of great ways to use metaphors and analogies and similes and comparisons to make something much more simple and much more relatable to your audience. So think about ways to do that. You'll come up with better ones than me, and that good. But definitely, yeah, simplified concepts, very important. Cool. So good science communication, we've covered strategy, we covered keeping it simple. Now we need to make it relatable. So whatever we're communicating to our audience has to relate to them. And this is a place that we often fall down in science communication. Now we might be teaching about climate change. We'll on and on about how bad climate change is and how we need to be concerned about it, and it's a big deal. What we fail to do is to answer the question, why does it matter to me? Right? And that can be true for something like Massasaugas as well, right? We want to save these snakes. To us, the snakes matter just because they matter. But to your audience, they need to know, well, why should I care? Why is it important to me? And it's not always an easy question to answer. But the technique we use for this is called framing. So framing is a technique which is exactly what it sounds like. It just means how are we packaging our information for our audience specifically. So you think about a concept, maybe it's snakes, you want to talk about snakes, how would you talk about all these different people? I mean, you wouldn't talk about it the same way to a 7-year-old who's maybe watched Wild Kratts and he loves animals, and a 70-year-old who's a little bit nervous of snakes, or a cottager who kills snakes. You're going to approach all of these in a different way. And for some people, this comes pretty intuitively. Some people, you can throw them into a crowd and they figure it out. For some people, it's really hard. This can be a really tricky thing to do, to like assess your audience and to dial that communication appropriately for your audience. It is something you can literally think about in advance, for sure. Like you can plan this out, even if your communication is going to be informal. You can sort of think to yourself, what happens if I'm approached by a cottager who kills snakes? Or what happens if somebody asks me about their dog? Or what happens if the person's older or younger, or whatever it is? But something that's very, very important to think about. There's a great blog, if you're into this kind of thing, called Southern Fried Science by a guy named Andrew Taller. And he says, when I speak about climate change, I don't speak about science. Sounds a little bit ridiculous, a very scientific concept, but he says when I speak about climate change to farmers, I talk about crop yields and growing seasons. And when I speak about climate change to people who fish for a living, we talk about the seasonal fish movements and what they're catching these days. Because nobody cares about the science. What they care about is, how does this affect me? People are selfish creatures. We all are, right? We care about what matters to us the most. And so what we need to do is make our topic matter in some way to our audience. That could be by giving specific things, specific benefits of the thing you're talking about. So we're talking about snakes, and I talk about rodent control. That's important. That's a specific benefit. It might be through generally raising appreciation, right? If we can get people to connect with the snakes, to appreciate them for their own merits, that's great as well. We make them relevant in that way. There's different ways to look at it, but relevance is really important. And if possible, draw on your audience's personal experience. Now, we don't always know our audience's personal experience or circumstance. If you're just out in the general public talking about snakes, you don't know what their deal is. But if you're talking to a cottage association, you know a little bit about their personal experience and circumstance, right? If you're talking to a class of kindergartens, we know a little bit about their personal experience and circumstance because they're 5, and 5-year-olds are all basically the same. But they share a lot of personal life experience, right? And so that's what matters. So think about your audience's personal experience and think about how you can make your communication as relatable as possible. You have to tailor it. You can't just go general. And emotions are always relatable because we all have them, right? So I might not know much about climate change. I know what happy feels like. I know what sad feels like. And in science, in InReach, we're taught to keep emotion out of it, right? We're supposed to communicate science very dryly and very objectively. But in science communication, there's so much room for emotion, whether that's the emotion of maybe something you're talking about. So we might call, rattlesnakes are super wimpy. That's an emotion kind of, right? Fear is an emotion. They're super wimpy and they rattle their tail because they're scared of the big thing and they want the big thing to go away. That's super relatable, right? The person you're talking to has been scared before. They know what scared feels like. So that's a really relatable thing, and we can get them relating to the animal. Or it might be about relating to you. Man, when I see a rattlesnake in the wild, it just makes me so happy. It makes me happy they're still out there and they're still doing their thing. And that gets them relating to me. They know what happy feels like. That makes it relatable. So don't be afraid to share your emotions. It's a super valuable tool. And to use like emotion words for the things you're talking about too. We don't want to go crazy overboard with emotions with snakes probably, but wimpy and fear and stuff like that's perfectly reasonable for sure. So I think we can go at least that far. This is a slightly weird concept as well, but we'll take one little step back into psychology, because there's this concept in psychology called regulatory focus. Regulatory focus tells us that people are either motivated to avoid negative things, right? We should act now to fight climate change because otherwise all this bad stuff's going to happen, or to get positive things. We should act now to fight climate change because imagine the way the world could be if we take all these actions and we do good things for climate change. Imagine how good the future could be. And people fall generally on one side of that or the other. It's about 50-50. And there's no way to know, like I'm talking to all of you right now, and I don't know which side you fall on, right? You could be a doom and gloom person, or you could be a sunny future person. I don't know. So when I compose my messages, I try to hit both, right? If I might be a doom and gloom person, but I need to make sure in my message about climate change, I also mention the sunny future, because some people are going to come at it from that way, and they're going to think I'm ridiculous for just sharing the doom and gloom. So it's important to keep that in mind as well, just something in the back of your head. Try to hit both sides. If we're talking about conservation Massasaugas, we want to avoid them going extinct. but we also want this beautiful world where Massasaugas are happy and healthy and doing well. And so it's just kind of nice to keep both of those in mind. Plus, I feel a lot of people in conservation are doom and gloom people, so it's nice to keep yourself a little bit more on the sunny side as well. Maybe that's, I don't know if that's about the kind of people who get into conservation or about what conservation does to you. Keep that in the back of your mind. Cool. All right, now we dive deep into the arts because good science communication in my mind tells a story. And this is my favorite aspect of science communication. I love storytelling. I grew up with a storyteller and I grew up learning to tell stories. And I still love telling stories. And it is an artistic discipline. It's something that people in science are discouraged from doing. But if you took creative writing in high school, this is the time to go back to that creative writing class because storytelling is super important. Before we really get into the art of it, we can talk a little bit. Cool. A little bit about the science of it as well. So science communication, storytelling story is actually well demonstrated in science communication for its efficacy in a bunch of different ways. So it helps people remember better. If you hear information in a story or a narrative, you actually remember it better than if you just heard a collection of facts, which when you think about it is really intuitive, right? Like if I just stand here for 10 minutes, I tell you everything I know about rattlesnakes, let's say. I mean, you already know about rattlesnakes. Think about something you don't know. You might walk away remembering one or two of those facts. But if I tie that information into a narrative where it has a flow and everything has context and everything connects to the last thing, it's way easier to remember those things. It makes way more sense to do it that way. And that's shown experimentally. We know that to be true. People understand the information better as well because all the pieces are contextualized. People digest it quicker, so they don't take as long. They won't ask as many questions. They argue less. So if you're communicating about something controversial, it actually has been shown that people who hear narratives will argue less about that controversial point. They engage more. They actually feel the experience as their own. There's some really cool neurobiology on this. So if you read a story where somebody in the story jumps, you activate the same neurons as if you jumped, right? So you actually people get immersed in a story, but you really get immersed in a story because you actually feel, your brain almost feels that you're having those experiences as though you're living them. So that makes stories really, really powerful. We can literally transport people or put them in an experience that we want them to have. It draws on emotional connection, right? It helps people connect emotion. Think about when you've read a book, or you've watched a movie where you've really connected emotion with the characters. Like stories help us really invest. And in a world where facts aren't going to be our big weapon, emotional connection is what we have to work with. And it's really, really valuable. And it's just more convincing. It's more convincing than just facts. So stories, don't have to sell stories too much. They're great. They're the best. There's lots of cool research about this. If you're interested, you should dive deep in it because it's really great. So does that mean that every time I communicate about Massasaugas, I have to tell like a once upon a time in a magical land type of story? No. So it doesn't have to be a super formal story with like this beautiful sort of narrative that's like out of a storybook. Absolutely not. What it means is that when I talk about any topic, I should try to make sure that my information has a flow. It has a thread that ties it together. It flows logically from one point to the next. It has a narrative. And that's really, really valuable. So what I try to do is I think of those key messages we were talking about earlier. I converted this example from snapping turtles, so hopefully it makes sense. I've been using snapping turtles forever. But I can pick my key messages about rattlesnakes. Maybe it's that they're ecologically important. That's a great one. Maybe it's that they're not as scary as you think they are, because everybody thinks they're terrifying. And maybe it's that they're at risk and they need our help. These are three good key messages. Incidentally, the human brain also experimentally shown to like things in threes. You don't have to have three key messages. You could have just one. That's fantastic. That's super simple. Threes are great though. And I like threes, maybe because I have a human brain. And then what we have is like all the information in our brain about like that might help these messages, right? So I have all the things I know about Massasauga rattlesnakes, and all these things might help me to convey the messages. Some of them might not. Some of them, maybe I'll just cut right out because they're not that useful. But what I want to do is take this cloud of information. I feel like my brain is always just a cloud of things, and I want to organize it in a straightforward way, which I do on paper because I cannot do it in my brain. So if you need to write it out, that's totally fair. So what I might do is I might put my key messages in an order that I think makes sense. I want to deal with the scary thing first because that's what everybody knows about Massasaugas. That's my hook. I'm going to be like, hey, when you think Massasaugas are scary, but let's talk about that. We want to cover that they're ecologically important. Now that I've convinced you that they're not that scary, I want you to know that they're actually really important. And then we can go into like, well, because they're important, clearly they need our help and we should help these guys. It's really scary that they're disappearing. And then I want to arrange in some logical way all of those pieces of information that might help to support these different things. And you would all do this differently. This is not like the be all and end all. This is just how I did it in 5 minutes. You're going to do it your own way. But I want to arrange them in a way that's super logical, right? And so I might have some thing to begin my presentation that plays on the way that Massasaugas are misunderstood. And then I might dispel some myths and I might tell them they're actually, they're not as scary as you think they are for these reasons. And actually, let's talk about the role they have in the environment, and they're important, and they live a long time, and they have this role in the food web, which is why it's really scary that there's species at risk, but we can help them, and we're just going to flow through this information in a lovely way. And if you have a point that doesn't fit somewhere, that's the time to be judicious, cut it out, right? If it doesn't support the narrative, gonzo. And that can be for question time later on or whatever else. So it's just a matter of simply coming up with that narrative, having that moment of thought to create a flow and a story. And your story would be different than mine. That doesn't make it worse, doesn't make it better. All stories are great. Come up with your own narrative that works for you. And you might trial and error them, right? Some narratives might work better than others. These stories, I find, if you do a lot of presentations or something, they evolve over time, and you find what the audience reacts to best. You get your little jokes in, and you get them laughing, and you figure out what works. But just think about the narrative for sure. Once we've got our narrative in place, we can think about adding some literary devices, right? So this is where we really get into arts. If you're a creative writer, I secretly believe that all scientists have an artsy side that's buried deep down, repressed by years of being in science. So tap into that artsy side, and we'll use some literary tools to help enhance our story. Now we have our narrative, we want to add the embellishments, right? So all good stories need a hook. A hook is that thing that catches people's attention. A bit of surprise, a question you can ask, or a question you can get them to ask is great. I always use as an example this tree, because I worked for the Arboretum in Guelph many years ago, and I had to do a lot of programs about trees. And trees, I'm just not that excited about trees. It's hard to get people excited about things you're not excited about. So I love this tree. This is the honey locust. It's a rare Ontario tree. It's got southern distribution. It's super important. And we always finish our thing on the honey locust. And I definitely have seen people, with a class of like 8-year-olds be like, okay, well, this is the honey locust, and it's a species at risk in Ontario, and it's from southwestern Ontario, and it's got leaves like this. And I think I am so tuned out by 2 seconds into that. Even I'm not listening, much less 8-year-olds. But the honey locust is covered in huge spines. So why is my hook not just like, look at these giant spines? What do you think these are for? And now we've asked a question, and now they're engaging and they're thinking about it, right? So if I can ask a question, or I can get them asking a question, if I can use some sort of surprise or emotional connection, great. That hooks them in. It makes them want to know more. You have to give them a reason to want to hear the things that you're about to say. In the case of the honey locust, if you're not an Ontario tree expert, which I definitely am not, but I did work at the Arboretum, honey locust has giant spines because it co-evolved with mammoths, right? It co-evolved with mammoths many years ago, and now the mammoths are extinct, but the honey locust still has spines. So it's like an African acacia. I don't think we call them acacias anymore. Not a tree expert, but it has spines to protect it from giant mammals. So we can go down that road with the kids. What do you think the spines are for? What do you think they do? And we can be guessing about that character, that mammoth that kids have heard about, but is very abstract. We can use then characters in our story. Science hates characters, but science communication loves characters. So if I'm talking about a mammoth, he becomes a character in my story, right? He's hungry, he's looking for something to eat, he has his own motivations, he's doing things. The tree can be a character in my story, right? Why not? The tree has its own motivations in a very non-conscious kind of way, wants to live, wants to not be knocked over by a mammoth, or I could be a character in the story, right? If I'm talking about rattlesnakes to somebody, often I'm the character, because I want to tell you about a time I saw one and something cool that happened or something like that. Or the rattlesnake could be a character because it has its own motivations as well. But using a character, people connect with characters, right? It creates that opportunity to connect folks. So if the rattlesnake is an abstract thing that we're talking about, it's a species that lives in nature and it does this and it does that, it's hard to connect with it. But if the rattlesnake is a character who's trying to survive and trying to, not get eaten by scary predators and trying to find food, then all of a sudden we can connect a little bit more with it. We can understand it a little bit more. And I have the opportunity to weave in those pieces of biology into this more complex character. And that's super useful. And yeah, don't be afraid to make yourself a character too, because people want to hear about your experiences. If you had a cool story with the Massive Saga, that becomes part of your talk, right? That can work really, really well. Once we have our characters, we can give them a point of view. A point of view, I think, is really useful as well if we want to get into the imagination and into some emotional connection. Traditionally in science communication, the point of view is mine. I am the communicator. It's my point of view, right? I'm just going to tell you what I think. But why? Why should it be that way? Think about other things. And if you are, maybe you feel a little bit intimidated by point of view, the best word to use in my mind is imagine. Imagine you're a lion. Imagine you're a biologist studying lions. Imagine you're a rattlesnake. Imagine you're a moose and you almost step on a rattlesnake, right? Put yourself in the mind of the characters in your story. It helps to connect with what they're thinking and why they're doing what they're doing. People don't understand snakes. I want them to understand snakes better. So let me build a character for you in a way. It doesn't have to be super complex. Build a character sounds really intense, but let me at least give the snake its own sort of motivation so you can help understand why it does what it does, right? That's the way I think about it. Anthropomorphism, contentious in biology. Biologists hate anthropomorphism. I am somewhat on the fence for it, but I do think to some degree it's a useful tool. We want to be careful. So anthropomorphism is like giving a human character to a non-human animal, right? Or a non-human object. We want to be careful not to make any inaccuracies, not to make people think something that's not true. Happens a lot with snakes. People really want to think they're smarter than they are. But I think things like, a rattlesnake is really wimpy. That's a bit anthropomorphic, right? That's a human character to be wimpy, but I think it's accurate to its biology as well, right? They are wimpy, so that's fair. I think there's a line to walk here. It might not be so much giving the snake human characters, but maybe referring to it in more human terms. It's not it's not a thing that lives in nature. We can use words like wimpy. It has its own brain, even if it's very simple. It has its own motivations in life. So think about anthropomorphism. Don't make people believe things that aren't true. Sometimes you can use anthropomorphism and then just make it clear that you're kind of joking, and then we can kind of come back to the biology. It is a tool in your toolbox to be used a little bit judiciously, but something to think about as well, and not to be as feared as traditional science makes you think. Use imagery in the senses. This is where we tap into your creative writing as well. So stories that use great imagery, that tap into the senses, that make you feel what the characters are feeling are more impactful than ones that are dry in their language. Again, with snakes, for example, this could be even a window to teach about snake senses. We could talk about smell. We could talk about how a lot of them aren't that good at seeing. We can talk about what they hear or don't hear. So using the senses are relatable in the same way that feelings are relatable because we all have them. And so using them to paint a picture is really, really valuable. All of this is really working towards emotional connection and empathy. And especially with snakes, this is super important because people don't connect with them emotionally and people don't feel empathetic towards them. And so we're really trying to use every tool we have to generate empathy for the snake, to generate a connection with the snake, because that's going to motivate people to act for the snake. And it's amazing how often, you can use I've had conversations with people where you talk about a snake and its experiences, and you talk about all the predators that are out there trying to eat the snake, and you talk about whatever else. And they sort of go, you get to a point in the story maybe where the person goes, oh, and you're like, oh, I bet you didn't expect to feel sorry for a snake today, did you? And now we're having that connection, right? And suddenly they're understanding a little bit more deeply than we did before. So think about ways you can connect people. This goes back to that like theory of planned behavior and the way the human brain thinks. Emotions are more powerful than facts at getting people to act a certain way or getting people motivated. So storytelling. Some people go more towards it than others. I love a little storytelling. Okay, almost there. Good science communication, it focuses on the positive. I said science people tend to be doom and gloom, and I do find that to be generally the case. But there's only so much capacity in your audience for doom and gloom. But humans have this concept that's sometimes described as a finite pool of worry. What that means is you have a limited capacity for negative information. And I'm sure we've all felt this before on some level. So when you hear something really negative, like climate change, you hear a bunch of climate change news, like all things are worse than we thought. You have this maybe sense deep down in you, maybe it's closer to the surface for some of us than others, that you kind of just want to shut it down. You're like, I can't handle this today. I got other things to think about. I'm stressed about the world every day and I can't deal with it right now. You literally have like this finite pool, like this limited capacity to deal with negative things. And things that are more personal to you or more immediate in their scope get priority. They get to go in the pool first. So if that's like your financial worries or your car is broken or your kids are, I don't know, evil, as they all are, that gets in the pool first. And everything else like climate change and species at risk and outdoor cats and all that stuff, that gets pushed to the outside and it's harder to worry about it. And so when we're trying to get in with like a concern about conservation or a species at risk, that can be hard to like wedge into the pool for people. They're limited in their capacity. And when we're confronted with too much negative information, we have like coping mechanisms. Some of these might sound familiar to you as well, but it's not familiar to me. When we're overwhelmed by negative information, we use things like emotional numbing, where you kind of just dial it down, like the emotion just gets kind of suppressed, or compassion fade, where you just don't really care anymore. You're like, I've heard about this so many times, I just kind of can't care about it right now. I can't deal with it. That's like a normal human response that psychologists know about. So you're not abnormal in that way. That's like a very normal thing to feel. And there's a way that we sometimes cope with it called the single action bias. My favorite example of this is straws, because ocean plastic is horrible and the world is absolutely going in the trash can. So I'm going to use reusable straws and that's going to fix the world and everything's okay. And then we stop thinking about it because we've addressed that negative emotion. We've taken that single action and now we feel good about ourselves and we can kind of push that out of the way for a while. So we've got all these coping mechanisms to deal with this influx of negative information. So if we're communicating something negative, like a species at risk or like about cottagers killing snakes or whatever it is, we need to think about it fairly strategically. And again, there's like no magic. Oh, hey, there's one more in there. I forgot about. Hey, there's one more thing we use to deal with negative information, and that's something called the backfire effect. And we've all experienced this probably in communication as well, which basically just tells us that when people hear information that conflicts with what they believe, you'd think they would be like, oh, hey, that's useful information, and I'm going to believe something different. But instead, they tend to reject that information and double down, right? And that's like the climate change denier is a classic example of that, right? Where it's like, yeah, no, I don't believe any of that. And actually, it's all a hoax. And they just double down on it. And that's an actual thing that is studied in psychology as well. That's for real. So intellectual challenge, it actually causes the same reaction as a physical challenge. So when you're challenged intellectually, something challenges your beliefs, it causes the same reactions in your brain, that like fight or flight that you would have if you were challenged to a physical fight. So that's the emotion that you're dealing with, right? You're kind of, if you tell somebody something that conflicts with a core belief that they hold, you're like actually fighting them. You're challenging them to a fight. So keep that in mind as well, for sure. So presenting people with information proven wrong doesn't always do the trick. What are we to do? Well, there's some strategic ways that we can approach this. Again, no magic bullet for it. We just have to use some broad concepts to try to break through this opposition to negative information. So we need to be honest. If we are talking about a species at risk, we're talking about climate change, or we're talking about outdoor cats killing birds, whatever it is, we're not sugarcoating. We are being honest about the situation, for sure. But be strategic about what you include. Don't inundate with all kinds of negative stats or doom and gloom prospects. Be honest about the problem and support it strategically with a little bit of fact, but don't inundate. Make emotional appeals. We talk about emotion being better connected with fact, for sure. So we're trying to get people to connect emotionally with the issue much more than we're trying to just fill them up with facts. It can be helpful to acknowledge that there are other concerns, right? I know there's lots to worry about right now. I know there's a lot going on in the world, and I know you're worried about your kid's safety or your dog's safety or whatever else, and that's totally makes sense. That's very logical. But let's also talk about this, right? So be honest, people don't negate their concerns. Even if something as simple as, somebody's afraid of a garter snake, I'm not gonna be like, well, that's stupid. Don't be afraid of a garter snake. I have to understand that, like, that's a reasonable concern. I understand you're concerned about your safety, but let me also tell you some things about garter snakes that might help alleviate that fear. So acknowledge the pre-existing concerns and work from there. Have the conversation like a human being. Emphasize the value of individual action and empower with control. So when we're talking about something big like species at risk or like climate change, sometimes the feeling can be, well, I'm just one person. Like, what can I do about that? I can't fix climate change as one person. So there are individual actions you can take for climate change. There are individual actions you can take to help rattlesnakes. Let's talk about some of those. And like, it can have a really big impact. If you watch for them on the road, you make sure you don't run them over. If you take these little individual actions on your property, you can actually help these guys. That can be like a big deal. And that animal lives for a long time. So like, you're really helping that snake out for like a long time. And empower with control. People think they can't. That goes all the way back to that theory of planned behavior. If they think they can't, then they won't. So if you can find ways to empower people, to impress upon them that they have control over their situation, that's going to motivate them to act. And provide a hopeful takeaway. None of that doom and gloom, scientists. It's be all well and good to be like, we're past the point on climate change, we can't do anything about it. But nobody's even going to try then. You have to believe, you have to help people believe that we can fight it, we can do good, we can be hopeful in the future. So think about that as well. Last thing, good science communication is personal. Science InReach, your science degree, taught you to be impersonal if you took one. But good science communication is personal, and I think being personal is one of your greatest weapons in science communication. I often think, especially, I've done a lot of teaching for public speaking, for doing presentations about nature, and I think one of the most difficult things, but one of the most effective things you can do is find a way to be genuinely and comfortably yourself in front of an audience. If you can be you, then the audience will connect with you. If you're too nervous to be you, right, then you're a little bit harder to connect with because you're all tight and concerned and not really sure. And if you try to be somebody else, people will see through that and they will call you on it. I've seen people try to do little characters in their presentations. It's tough, man. Even a 5-year-old is like, that guy is not really being genuine to me right now. So being you is super important. And if you can find a way to be comfortably yourself, and it does take practice, it's not easy to do for a lot of folks, especially if you are nervous, speaking in front of others, that sort of thing. But being comfortably yourself is a huge weapon in your arsenal to communicate science. The reason you want to communicate about Massasaugas, I assume, is that you like them and you think they're important. And you should let that show. You should make that like at the forefront of your communications. If people believe that it's normal to hate Massasaugas and everybody hates Massasaugas and everybody kills them and they're dangerous, then that's all they know. But if you are the person who absolutely loves Massasaugas and you think they're so important, they're so fascinating, and they deserve to live and to have a healthy, prosperous life, that's that person's counterpoint. They're going to pick up on that. And if you have genuine enthusiasm for your subject, our human brain is built to grab that and to mirror that. We have mirror neurons, right? We pick up on emotions from other people and we express those emotions ourselves. And it starts to create that positive association, right? Those heuristics tell us that we fall back to our associations. And if our only association with snakes is negative, it's our parents being afraid, it's our neighbors being afraid, then our association is negative. But if when I think of rattlesnakes, the first thing that comes to my mind is like that person at the presentation who just freaking loved rattlesnakes, all of a sudden my associations are very positive and I'm going to take different shortcuts and I'm going to go in a different direction. Don't be afraid to share personal details, personal anecdotes. You don't have to share your whole personal life if you don't want to, but the more personal you get about it, the more people are going to believe it and they're going to see that it's genuine and it comes from a real place. So connect as a human being. Some of that, like number one piece of advice I often want to give science communicators is a good shake and just the words, talk like a human being. Because it seems to be so difficult for people. You put them in front of an audience, they feel they need to be very formal or they need to speak in a certain way. Just talk like yourself, just talk like a human person. It's such a great way to connect to other folks and to sort of dispel that sense of like, I'm the expert and you're not. But actually, we're just both people that are chatting about things that are interesting and important to us. That's a way better way to approach your communication. So think about that. A little bit of humanity goes a long way. And just have fun. Be yourself and have fun. For me, science communication is the most fun thing in the world. Like I think of myself as an introverted person and you put me at a party and I'll be in the corner, but you put me in front of an audience of 200, I'm in my element. I love it. It's so much fun to interact with people, not to lecture at people, but to interact and to see the way they react to you and to have that conversation, that dialogue. It's so rewarding. So be yourself, share your love for the subject matter. It's contagious and it's super fun. So that is, I don't know how I'm on time, but that's it for me. So thank you for hanging out with me and letting me blabber at you. And yeah, I look forward to answering some questions in the panel discussion afterwards.